Do we think we're live? I see live on YouTube on my screen. So. All right. I'm going to call this meeting to order. This is the Cumberland County, Maine Board of Commissioners. This is our meeting of Tuesday, July 21, 2020. We are meeting at the Cumberland County Courthouse, and public participation is by live streaming on YouTube. And if anyone wants to submit a public comment during the time or wants to ask a question, if you could email your questions to kennedy@cumberlandcounty.org. That's Kennedy, KENNEDY @cumberlandcounty.org. Prior to or during the meeting, we'll have a couple of opportunities to check messages, and we'll be happy to read those out. And if there are questions, we'll give whatever answer seems appropriate at the time. So first, I would entertain a motion to approve the minutes of the regular meeting of June 24, 2020.
So moved. Second.
Moved by Commissioner Cloutier, seconded by Neil Jameson. Any discussion? All in favor signify by saying aye, please.
Aye.
Aye. And any opposed? Seeing none, that passes unanimously. Next is informational reports and presentations. I think Sheriff Joyce, you have some data for us and a presentation you'd like to make. So you have the floor.
Okay, so I made a handbook or a notebook of some ideas of what we look at and what we're doing, and whether it's with law enforcement. So the first part is the last OEA accreditation report from June 2019. OEA is the law enforcement accreditation that we've been involved in since 2014. The second is our current use force. It's undergoing some revision as we speak, so that's the one we're operating on today. That's a use of force policy. The third part is the use of force analysis for law enforcement, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. The fourth section is the use of force analysis for correction, and then section 5 is just a miscellaneous document, a document that will send out to the Maine Police, Maine Sheriff's Association, etc. With regard to
what's been going on with protests and the tragic event that occurred in Minneapolis, Minnesota, the end of May. The Sheriff's Office for law enforcement, we're one of 7 accredited agencies in the state of Maine. We're the only Sheriff's Office in the state of Maine, and there are under 5% nationally law enforcement agencies that are accredited, which addresses some of the best practices in public safety, sound training programs, defined lines of authority, commitment to integrity, transparency, and accountability. We provide training in bias-based policing, de-escalation, and acceptable use of force practices and procedures. And the deputies receive the use of force training on a yearly basis to the highest levels of policing standards. So accreditation, what is it? It's data-driven decision-making. You'll notice in the law enforcement part especially, but throughout the CALEER report, that we track use of force, how many pursuits that the deputy's been involved in. We track what we call awards, or anytime somebody gives an accolade, we track that. But we also track discipline, and it's done through an IA Pro program that allows us to kind of be aware of what's going on, and we can set it. We currently set the early intervention program to about 6 negative aspects. And when I say negative, they're use of force, discipline, pursuits, etc. Because those are the areas whereby if somebody is doing their job, they're going to be in those areas, and we want to make sure that we know that periodically that this program allows us to know that a deputy is is doing these events. If somebody has discipline, then that will also trigger it as well. After 6 events, the early warning system activates, and then a captain meets with that officer to determine whether or not there's something going on in the person's life. You know, it may be that the person is a active person out there doing his job every day, and if that's the case, then that person's going to trigger 6 events. If a person is coming in late for work, that may mean something other than maybe it's an illness, maybe it's a problem with their family. There are a bunch of different things. Use of force, the same thing. You know, I remember when I was a sergeant on the street, I had a guy that I think he used 5 use of forces in a 4-day period. And when I looked at it, the guy was a hard charger, and he was involved in some chases, and not every arrest went very well for him that particular week. So it allows us to kind of monitor that, and it triggers a captain to actually look at somebody that has hit that early intervention to ask why and what's going on. Ongoing measurements, if you look in here as well, every year I get a report on use of force. Now, we have to also report the use of force to the Maine Criminal Justice Academy. That's a state requirement. So, yes, yeah. And again, I mean, it's a compilation, it's a summary, but we have to send that up as well as the mandatory training. It's mandated. It's mandated by legislation. We have to do it every year. But we also have to do it for accreditation, because every year we have somebody from outside of the state of Maine, an individual that works for CALER that will come in, a practitioner in law enforcement, and they'll start looking at our policies and make sure that we're meeting all the standards, and that we are looking at our use of forces on a yearly basis, looking at our pursuits on a yearly basis, looking at grievances, looking at our hiring practices. One of the challenges we've had with hiring is the fact that the standard for hiring for accreditation is your agency should look like the community you serve. So, you know, if we're 80% white and 10% black and 10% Hispanic, then hopefully our workforce is like that. But that's a bit of a challenge, because you get what you get when people apply. Same thing with males and females. You know, we have to look at that and analyze that on a yearly basis. You know, how many females do we have? Yeah, I can tell you in 2014, when we were first accredited, we had a few females, and we've been able to increase that. But again, you get what you get when people apply. And as much as we've tried to go out and recruit, you know, that is something that every year we're defending why our workforce doesn't look like the community we serve. So we do that. I tell my staff it's continual improvement. Some of our policies are mandated by the state: domestic violence, crisis intervention, use of force. There's about 12 of them that are mandated by the state that have to hit certain standards. And then the accreditation, the national accreditation, pushes you a little further in some of those standards. Now, keep in mind, we're not mandated to be accredited. It's voluntary. But while Department of Corrections for corrections, but the academy requires certain policies, et cetera. So we have to be able to mandate. We meet those and show that we meet that mandate as well. And we report on a yearly basis. It's continual improvement. You know, we're always looking at our policies. Do they work? You know, after a pursuit, we pull together a board, and that they review the pursuit and decide whether or not the person acted within policy, whether or not the supervisor monitored it, and do we have to make changes because of things that we could not have predicted to occur, and we adjust it with that. We may adjust it because of case law, where certain case law comes out and it says that what we're doing is not right or whatever, and we'll adjust it for that. So we're really doing continual improvements. It shows progressiveness, accountability, and bias-based profiling. We also have to, and this becomes a little bit of a challenge, but we have to look at our warnings and citations. I call them summonses, but for accreditation, it's citations. And we have to look at it and say, okay, how many tickets did we give to white people? How many warnings? And then that's broken into male, female. And then how many black people, male, female, and then how many Hispanic, and then other. The challenge in Maine, and what we've had a hard time with, is when we look at the end, there's a lot of other. And that other is because of the fact that the Maine license doesn't require an individual to determine or put down what race they are. So it's left to the deputy to try to determine, and they really don't want to be in that spot of determining, because, you know, all it takes is one mistake and, you know, somebody can be offended by that. So that is a challenge that hopefully the state of Maine, at some point, when they look at some of the racial bias issues, that, you know, they make somebody, you know, determine what race they are so that we can actually track that. Because it's not real accurate. It's only as accurate as the information in that. But we have to report on that on a yearly basis as well. The use of force, moving on to that, obviously with chokeholds being an issue, intervention by the officers, et cetera, the chokehold has always been in our policy. The only time a chokehold is appropriate is if you have the authority or you have the need to use deadly force. If somebody's got you by the throat or has got a gun and you've got them around the throat and deadly force is justified, that's the only time chokeholds are justified. Other than that, not justified. We're going to probably clean that up. I can tell you through accreditation, because I'm one of the commissioners that sit on the board. We're working on that clarification. And it becomes really problematic, because at a time when I'm fighting for my life and I can't use the tools that I have on my belt, it may be a chokehold, or it may be that base adjacent to the table that I grab the base and hit somebody over the head with it to try to get them to break that hold so I live another day. So we're really struggling with, you know, what are the other things that could be around that we may have to use, God forbid, if we're ever put in that spot. You know, as far as the intervention on a partner seeing something occur, that's not in our use of force, but we talk about it in training. You know, we talk about it in ethics. You know, this thin blue line that, you know, is always talked about. The bottom line is, if you see somebody doing something wrong, you are expected to intervene. You know, is it in our policy for use of force? No. Will it be going forward? Yes, because the state wants it. Accreditation is going to want it. And you have to put it in your policy to the lowest common denominator, somebody that may not be able to use common sense. So that's why this is being addressed. One of the other things that were brought up by some folks is the stair-stepped use of control. When I started 30 some odd years ago, you had a stair-step use of control. That was your presence. Then, you know, the next step was your controls, any hand controls, arm bars, et cetera, et cetera. You know, at the time, we had OC. So OC was the next step if you needed to get there. Then we added the baton. And then, you know, most of my staff, with the exception of command staff, carry tasers. And then, of course, you had the firearms. So you had a stair step. Some of the practitioners that dealt with this and some attorneys said, well, you know, it was kind of beat in your head. You start up the stairway, and then if something happens where you don't need to use, let's say, the taser, then you back down the stairway. But it was kind of confusing because everyone had different stairways. If you didn't have a taser, then you went from baton or ASP baton to firearm or anything else you use. So that changed in the early 2000s to situational use of force. Situational use of force is, you know, if I show up and there's a disturbance, hopefully when I show up and get out of the car, my presence, you know, lets that and makes that disturbance go away. But if somebody pulls a gun because they see me, then I have to jump to deadly force, which means firearm. And you're jumping beyond, you know, hands-on. You're jumping beyond OC. You're jumping beyond taser. You're jumping beyond ASP baton. And you're going right to firearm. Yet if the guy does not fire a round and you're lucky enough that he drops the firearm, then you're back down to your presence or anything in between there. So it's situational based on the situation. You know, some of the folks that were, asking out the warning before you use deadly force. Well, we always do that. I mean, that's controlled by federal law or case law. That, if I pull my firearm and say, police, drop the gun, police, drop the gun, that's a warning. But if I'm talking to somebody and all of a sudden it deteriorates just like that, they pull a gun, you're not going to be able to say, police, drop the gun. You got to act. So, I mean, that requirement is really situational as well. So those are some of the force issues that people have been bringing up that we need to wrestle with. The question was asked, how much force do we use at the Cumberland County Sheriff's Office for law enforcement? That was pretty easy, actually. Jim called me one day and said, hey, how much force do you use? And if you look at page 21, it breaks it down into race, sex. In the end, at the end of the year, I think it was 0.0009% of the time that we made an arrest or had interaction with somebody, we use force. And then that force is broken down into, was it aspeton, was it OC spray, was it hands-on, was it taser, et cetera. So that kind of breaks it out so that I can look at it and realize that on 21 that, 95% of the time we were using force on white folks, and 5% of the time it was on a person of color. Then we track it on what is the race and sex of the deputy as well, because that's important too, to make sure that we don't have any somebody of a certain race, taking out on another person of a certain race. So, that demographics is helpful. Page 23, again, it breaks it down by age so that we can look at we know that at the end of the day in 2019, the person that we used the most force on was going to be somebody between the ages of 30 and 39. And consequently, the highest use of force is usually by a deputy between the ages of 30 and 39. So that tells us, okay, we kind of know who might use force. Now, that may change in 2020, but it helps us gauge where our target audience is. Page 20, it talks about the various, various uses of forces, whether it's a body lock, a bear hug, taser, chemical agent. And what we do is we compare 2019 to 2018 and determine, what's the change. Now, when you're looking at it, if you see a big swing, the obvious question is, okay, why all of a sudden are we using taser, not in this case, but why are we using taser more this year than we ever used last year? Is that because the tasers are new, they have another component? It makes us ask the question, did we provide training? Or if we're using tasers 10 times and then the next year we use it 0 times, was it the training we provided that caused them to think, geez, I can use something other than taser to try to take care of the disturbance or whatever they're dealing with. We track the fact of, what was the person, what do we think was going on with the person when the use of force was? It looks like alcohol is the number one, followed by mentally ill. But again, that can be subjective to the officer because they've got to fill out something. And quite frankly, sometimes mentally unstable is what we have there. It may or not be that. That's page 18. I'm bouncing around, sorry. Page 18. And then page 16, we talk about the calls for service. And we total up the calls for service, and that's where I come up with the 0.0009. Basically, in the 2019, for 24,396 calls for service, the use of force for the law enforcement division was 22 through the year. So there's a lot of information there. I review it, I take a look at it. It helps me determine what the training priorities are. It helps me determine, what do we have to look at to say, okay, why are people gravitating to one over the other? Again, going back to the IA Pro, if we're starting to see somebody use a lot of force that didn't use force before, maybe it's because all of a sudden they're doing their job, or maybe it's something personal in their life, and it begs us to ask the question. So always monitoring this, and we have to do it every year under the law enforcement accreditation. The next part, we're not required by ACA, which I'm kind of shocked at, but we're not required to analyze use of force through ACA, which is the corrections accreditation. Now, they look at use of force, but they don't require you to analyze it every year. So I looked at the law enforcement, and I like this report. This is the first year we've been able to generate this report under this new software program called IA Pro. So prior to the incident in Minneapolis, I had asked I want to see what corrections use of force is, because they're dealing with a lot more people. They're dealing with a lot more people of color because of the fact that, we are the place where inmates or arrestees are brought in. So we were able to recreate, even though it's not required, a view of the corrections use of force as well. And again, we look at what are the highest peaks of the week. What is it? What are the seasons look like? All 4 seasons, pretty even there. Day of the week is usually a Monday, kind of defies logic on that. The use of force is kind of spread out pretty equally. Obviously, the laid out, so the 11 p.m. to 07 is a little less. On page 9, intake area. Generally, this is where we see uses of force in intake, because most people, they're intoxicated, they may be mentally ill, they don't want to be in jail, we've interrupted, or the law enforcement has interrupted their evening, and they don't want to be there. So that's usually where we're going to see use of force is typically used. That's not to say that other pods, so we list the pods of where the use of force is used. And again, when I look at this and when I looked at it, because I'm visual, it tells me where I can expect the use of forces, and that's probably where I put my resources for any improved technology to help out with use of force or to mitigate use of force, training, etc. But also realizing that people can cycle through and work in intake. I can't lose sight of that as well. It breaks down on page 20 of the service being rendered. Again, the intake process, pod dispute, that's a potential fight that occurs. Page 21 then breaks down the officer's assessment of the inmate's condition. So you can see that mentally unstable is the highest, some non-detected and unknown. Again, for the corrections officer, it can be difficult to try to figure out what exactly is causing this person to be assaultive, combative, etc. And it can be a subjective decision based on that. Method of force, we look at that, the direct control. Yeah. Yeah. This is recognized during any of the, this is all of the use of forces. So, well, yeah and no. I mean, what I can tell you is, and what I've told the legislature is, about 80% of our clientele at the jail are dual diagnosis, substance use, mentally ill. They call it co-occurring disorder. And again, that's, you may know somebody coming in because they've been in before, and we have documentation from mental health that this is a mental health issue. And then the mental health issue is really broken down to, is it mental health or is it a behavioral? I don't want to be here, so I'm going to act like I've got mental health for whatever reason. And that's really difficult to do at the onset. It isn't until our mental health providers start, working with these folks, especially the new people that have never been in before, that judgment starts to occur. Obviously, if somebody's intoxicated, you can kind of smell it, that. And then with substance use, sometimes it's real clear, sometimes it's not real clear. And that's why you see a lot of other or I can't make a decision not detected, because, again, you're asking a non-mental health clinician, corrections officers, to try to make a judgment on whether or not it's mental illness or not. And that's where we need to kind of refine it. And that's kind of the frustration for law enforcement and corrections, is that, in a lot of cases, we're trying to determine that and work with that with, no PhD, no master's degree, in most cases, 48 hours or 40 hours of training. And I'll get to the training in a little bit. So again, we go to the method of force, direct control, escort. That's basically grabbing somebody's arm. Our standard is this: if I ask you to do something, not use of force. If I come up and grab you and I guide you along, that's a use of force. That requires a report to be done. That report requires it to be signed off as it goes up through the chain. That's the minimum use of force. If I say, turn around, put your hands behind their back, they do that, that's not use of force. But if I've got to grab them and force their arm to put the handcuffs on, that's use of force. So those are the standards we use to trigger a report, which then dumps into this report. We, much like the law enforcement, and again, this took forever to do because we're not in that mode, but we're going to be in that mode going forward because it's great information. The demographics, race and sex of the inmate that we use the force on. Again, for this group, 17.5% of the arrests or the people we deal with over the course of a year have been on Black individuals, 3.1% on Hispanic, 2.1% on other, and then 77.3% on white males and females. Now, again, if you notice the other here, generally, when we get somebody into the jail, if we don't know what their race is, we ask them, and we can get that information. One says, well, can you do that at a traffic stop? It gets a little uncomfortable, Sometimes we have to do that because, somebody doesn't mandate their weight, or, they use the weight, I'm talking about licenses, that they were when they were 20, but now they're 50, and, they're still carrying that weight. But when you ask somebody their weight, for some people, that gets really sensitive, and you may or may not get an answer. So with the corrections, a little easier to try to figure out and the accuracy of the race and obviously sex. And again, something coming down the road, I hope that, and I don't know this as I sit here, I was going to check on it, we've got a third sex now, binary, and I'm hoping that at some point DMV, the Secretary of State, mandates that declaration as well, because, again, in order to try to figure out down the road of profiling, we're going to need that information to see, was it male, was there a female, was it binary? So some of the challenges going forward. We also look at the corrections officer, race and sex, and try to figure that out. Again, most of our corrections officers are white, so 95% of the time, it's going to be either a white female or a white male using force on an inmate and stuff. So, and that's why it's important to try to align our workforce with what our communities look like. We track by age, both the inmate and the corrections officer. That's on page 17. And 30 to 39 seems to be the magic number for at least corrections officers using force. But on the inmates, it's 20 to 29. So when I first started, I remember my supervisor, who was towards the end of his career, saying this is a young man's sport, what he was thinking about was, you know, when I'm out there working the road and I got to roll around with a 20 or 29-year-old, you know, now it's really time for me to figure out if that's really where I should be. So it kind of backs up what he was saying 30 years ago with that. We track years of service, and we do that with law enforcement too. And if you notice, at least in corrections, it's 14 years. I think for law enforcement, it was around 5 to 7 years. And that's probably when, you know, people are getting grounded on what their job is supposed to be and they're active, et cetera. Then we start looking at, you know, the officers, and if you notice starting on page 21, you know, it lists the officers. We look at the number of uses. Now, for instance, if you go down to the third line, you have an officer that's used it 6 times. So that would have triggered, just alone with the use of forces, an early intervention inquiry by the captain. Now, he works in intake, so we expect if somebody's working in intake, because you saw earlier, more likely than not that it's going to occur in intake, then that's probably why that is happening. But again, if you have somebody that doesn't use a lot of force and then all of a sudden they're on the radar spectrum, that could mean something. And that's why we want to interact before the person ruins their career, gets involved in something that they shouldn't have, or worse yet, gets charged criminally for overreacting. So really, that's kind of the 411 on the use of force and what we look at. Now for training, because training is a big part of accreditation, it's a big part of just keeping yourself out of trouble. We've done bias-based profiling. 2 years ago, we brought up an individual by the name of Dr. Bryant Marks. Now, the chief and I went to a training that was called the 21st Century. It was by President Obama, 21st Century Law Enforcement Study. And this Dr. Marks was there, and the guy was phenomenal. He's the founding director and principal trainer for the National Training Institute on Race and Equity. He's a professor in psychology. And when we left there, we said, we got to pay this guy to come up to Maine because he does a training on implicit bias. And, you know, I kind of went into it with the idea that, yeah, I don't have implicit bias. And when you come out, you realize you do have implicit bias. He gives you a test, and, you know, that test kind of solidifies, if you didn't believe it, it solidifies in your mind that, you know, you may think you don't have an implicit bias, but you do, you know. So we brought him up, and we tried to get as many of our people through it as possible, understanding you can't shut down the jail, send everybody, understanding that you still have to cover areas on the law enforcement side, and we opened it up to other law enforcement agencies. The District 2 training, which is the Cumberland County Chiefs, had scheduled for him to come up and do another training just before COVID, but unfortunately, because of COVID, they shut it down. So our goal was to try to get as many people through that as possible. The other thing is the mental health training. You know, my goal is to get everyone through a 40-hour crisis intervention training. Everybody, even the person that you meet when you come in the door that works in records, because our belief is that they can interact with somebody coming in that may have a mental illness. Over the weekend, we had an individual that lived in a homeless shelter, had a mental illness, and came to the jail to report what was going on in her shelter. And then we had to kind of work with her and with the Portland Police Department to try to work that out. So everybody will have CIT training. Right now, I've got 30 people that have attended 40 hours worth of CIT training, and with an additional 5 people that have had the 40 hours plus another 8 hours. Our law enforcement, we've got about 40 people that have gone through crisis intervention training. And that's basically trying to deal with people that have mental illness and trying to avoid arrest, trying to, you know, mitigate the situation, trying to get other people to come in and help out so that we don't have to go back to this house, you know, 20 times. I'm often saying to the patrol deputies, take domestic violence. If you've gone to the same house for domestic violence 25 times and arrested the person 25 times, what makes you think the 26th time is going to correct things? So now you start doing community problem solving and say, okay, what is the root cause on this? Same thing with the mental illness. What is the root cause on this? We had an individual a couple of years ago that may have had they had substance use, but also some mental illness, and they were calling 911 constantly. And, you know, the staff tried to work with her to try to discourage her from calling 911. If you want to talk to somebody, call something other than 911. So it becomes challenging. So crisis intervention training, if you've had it, helps you understand where they're coming from, helps you realize that, okay, you know, I don't have to arrest everybody that may have committed a crime, but for their mental illness that they caused them to do the crime. So that's a challenge, and we continue to do that. The classes are not that plentiful. And quite frankly, with COVID, it's kind of set us back a little bit because we've almost lost 2020 for training purposes. We also send people to a mental health first aid. Now, everybody who goes through the Corrections Academy gets 8 hours of it. Everyone who goes to the Maine Criminal Justice Academy gets at least 8 hours, and I'm not sure, it may even be more. And that's just, it's kind of, it opens the door to dealing with people and interacting with people with mental illness. It's not the 40 hours where you're really immersed into it, but it's something more than when I came out of the academy, you learned how to deal with people based on that so hot or that, you know, and I can tell you, you know, having done crisis intervention, basically a hostage negotiator and talking to people who had guns to their head and stuff, I had some training, but you learned a lot about the fact that what triggered somebody when you're talking to them and trying to tell them, put the gun down, you know, and you might hit something that really fired them up and you go, stay away from that. Or you might talk about family and realize that the person calmed down and you might be able to have a conversation. So this kind of helps them out with that. So for that particular training, and we've actually partnered with a psychologist in Falmouth to put this training on for the MSA. We did a bunch of classes, one in Portland, one in Augusta, and one in Bangor. And we were able to get 11 corrections officers and 5 law enforcement officers through that. So again, you know, for some, that's their training for mental health with the hope that you'll get into a CIT class. For others, it's you've had the CIT class, here's a refresher on mental health first aid for law enforcement. We've sent 20 people to verbal judo, 6 people from law enforcement, and 20 from corrections to verbal judo. And then other interactive mental health training, things like interacting with persons with mental illness, responding to crisis situations, interacting with a mentally ill inmate, crisis negotiations. We've had 139 corrections officers and 65 law enforcement officers gone to those miscellaneous trainings as well. So we try to soak that up as much as possible. There's not a training for de-escalation, just de-escalation. You know, in fact, I would refer to the mental health training as de-escalation training, but it's mental health training. So we not only provide the mental health training, but with de-escalation, that's really taught in the firearms and when to use force. You know, we go out and we have to qualify twice a year, but periodically we have an attorney come in and talk about Fourth Amendment and the philosophy of, you know, when are you using force? Why are you using force? You know, is it deadly? Is it non-deadly? You know, can it go the situational and back up and stuff? So there's classroom training that we sometimes lose sight of, but because of accreditation, you know, I hire an attorney to come in and talk about, you know, case law. And that's also backfilled with the Maine chiefs of police that oftentimes will offer these trainings mandated through the academy, mandated through the legislature as well. Dealing with folks with autism, that's a class that most of us had to take, whether it was online or classroom as well. You know, so you get a lot of the de-escalation through other modes of training, so to speak. And I've never seen a class, they might have one now, where the title is de-escalation, because there are various ways you can de-escalate a situation. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you, because I've worked with people that I've often said, one person can go into a fight with 100 people by themselves, de-escalate that. And I've worked with others that could go into a nursing home bingo game and fire people up and create a riot. And those are the folks that we really, need to give training to. Some of the other things you've heard about, there's groups that want to do away with the no-knock warrants. Really, that's a judge's decision. I mean, we apply for a warrant. Generally, no knocks are given when you've got a lot of drugs, and you're fearful they're going to flush it, or the person, the residents, you've done a threat analysis and you determined that the person has drugs. There's a lot of people there that have bad reputations. They've got criminal records, et cetera, and they got firearms. And these are the folks that you don't want to go up and knock on the door and stand in front of the door, because they're going to shoot through the door and bad things are going to happen. So, but that's done under the auspices of, you've got to ask a judge to give you a no-knock warrant. We just don't decide we're going to do a no-knock warrant tonight because it seems to be a good thing to do. They don't give them out like candy. You really have to earn the authority to do that. But again, it's based on, look, Judge, if we go to this residence, we're feeling that bad things are going to happen. So, we can't be knocking on the door and standing in front of the door. We got to do something different. So that I don't see law enforcement really impacting. I mean, whether the judiciary jumps on that or not, I don't know. But usually there's a reason for that. So really, that's kind of the thing that I thought I would address. I mean, I know that you may have some questions, and those are probably easier to deal with than try to hit all of the areas that I thought you might have a question on. So I'll answer any questions. The judge, any judge that's available. Well, there's a justice of the peace who's an attorney. Let's say Tina Smith. That we use her sometimes, but they've kind of shied away because right now, the way it was is you didn't have a judge on call. Some judges now they're on call. So at 2 a.m, it's you're calling a judge, going, "Hey, can I stop by and have you review this and sign a warrant?" But when that's not available, then the justice of the peace or maybe some other title that she holds does that.
I haven't been able to get my head around this woman, Breonna, or whatever her last name was, in Kentucky or wherever she was. Okay. And they went into the wrong house. I mean, it just seems like that was a failure on so many levels. So.
Yes.
Yes.
And again, I don't know
all the facts. I think there was some people that had a lot of history with law enforcement in there, but the target, I think, had left as well. I may be wrong on that. So, but yeah, that's one of the things when we're talking about warrants, you actually drive by and make sure that the warrant, the area that you're going to target and the house that you're going to target is the red house with black shutters, at 43 Forest Avenue. And you're testifying that you've checked that out. Can mistakes happen? Yeah, it can, but I think if you do due diligence, then you've covered every base that you possibly can.
Towards doing a more diversion at the front end, between the time that somebody gets arrested and they get booked. For example, if somebody picked up somebody and they obviously, or appear to obviously have a mental capacity issue, instead of taking them to jail, they get diverted to some.
That's the hope. I sat on a committee last summer into the fall, and it reported out in December for the legislature. It was chaired by Representative Charlotte Horn and Senator Kathy Breen. It involved DHHS, NAMI, Maine Behavioral Health, a lot of advocates for the mentally ill, DHHS, if I didn't mention that. Jonathan Sarback was part of that. MDOC, Maine Department of Corrections. There was a police officer there for most of the time, as I recall, the Commissioner of Public Safety. And we talked about this. And what came out of it was that from 8 to 5 o'clock, from 8 in the morning till 5 o'clock, Monday through Friday, there's a bunch of services, there's a bunch of options that you can use to, if somebody's having a problem and they want to talk to somebody, you can reach out to those folks. There's another 112 hours that there's nothing. And, you know, that's when it becomes, the law enforcement officer becomes the mental health provider, for lack of a better term. And the further west you go, that becomes even more important because, yeah, there's services in Bridgeton, but not a lot. And, you know, if you live in Baldwin, that's a long way to come in and get services support, especially if you don't have a license or you don't have support. So we spend a lot of time. People ask me, do your calls of service going up? Yeah, they're going up a little bit, but the amount of time they're spending at the call, mitigating these issues, it's gone up dramatically. You know, I told somebody, a new deputy not too long ago, if I went to some call when I first started, the person was threatening suicide, maybe once a month, maybe once every other month. Now it's like every day. And it wasn't long ago, I'm going to estimate about 3 months ago, in a pass down, we had 4 calls where people were suicidal. Now, that could be COVID related. That could be a lot of things. I mean, we don't know. We think it was COVID related, but it just may have been a bad day. But there were 4 people in the rural Cumberland County that we cover that were thinking one way or another they wanted to commit suicide, or at least their family members were concerned about that. So obviously we're sending people out there. But we also are cognizant of the fact that, we had a case the other day where an individual was going through a divorce, acting irrational, and we got a call, and he had a bunch of guns, and we went out there, and he walked by the deputy with a gun, hadn't committed a crime, went out, fired a couple rounds on his property, didn't commit a crime, acting really weird, and then he walked by the deputy again because we had no reason to use force. He hadn't committed a crime. Went back in his house, and we were trying to talk to him about maybe we can take the guns and stuff. And they looked at calling the tactical team out. And I said, no, we're not going to call a tactical team out because he hasn't done anything. And if we do, because of the fact that he's locked in his house and won't come out, won't talk to us, then are we creating a problem that if it turns bad, it's our fault? But I can tell you 30 years ago, if somebody was in their house and they were suicidal and they had a gun, we would stay there, negotiate, we'd, somehow kick the door in or do whatever. But we've taken a different stance on that because we don't want to be making things worse. So getting back to your comment, now I'll answer it. I think in Cumberland County, the report said, and I think there was some motivation to do it, that we would have like a crisis center. That if somebody needed to talk to somebody that had a mental illness and needed to talk to a professional, that we could either tell the family, here's a card, there's a crisis center in Westbrook on Main Street, 24 hours a day, take your loved one down there, and they can speak to somebody at 2 o'clock on Sunday morning. Or we could take them there. They wouldn't be in custody or anything else. Right now, you have two choices. If the deputy feels, or the police officer feels like, if I come back, bad things might happen. You look at it, is he a threat to himself or somebody else? And then you can take him into custody. But again, if that person doesn't want to go, bad things can happen. We don't like that, but, you know, it's expected that if somebody's a threat to themselves or somebody else, we got to do something. Or if they've committed a crime, that but for that mental illness, and then we go, okay, you broke a window, so criminal trespass, criminal mischief, we're going to lock them up for that. Those are terrible. Those are terrible ways of dealing with that. So this crisis center may be a good 24 hours that averts the hospital, averts the jail, and hopefully gets these folks some help that they need. And then there's some other things. I mean, you know, supposedly they have groups of people. I was mystified. In 30 years, I didn't even know they existed, where they will go out and meet with some of the mentally ill. The unfortunate thing is, they're probably not going to go out at 2 a.m. on the backside of Anderson Road in Sebago, on a dirt road that's got a pie plate that says, you know, Fire Road 36. And if they do that, they're going to expect us to be there, and we're going to have to stay with them and stuff. So that is our biggest challenge. You know, mental illness is our big challenge. If, in fact, and my fear is they're going to take money here from law enforcement and put it in mental illness and hope that that catches on, we're still going to end up going to them until there's a system whereby it slowly takes it away from us and puts it on mental health professionals that should be dealing with this, because we're not professionals. We try to be. So that's kind of a long-winded answer, sorry, but I mean, I could go on for hours on all of this. Yeah, no. I mean, homeless is, it's moving west. It's moving north. I mean, you know, Brunswick has homelessness now. Never thought of that. I've often said we had a homeless individual in Wyndham Raymond, and it's hard to be homeless in the western part of Cumberland County because you don't have the services you do here. And sometimes the winters are a lot longer because you don't have the shelter that you have here, whether it's a tree or a park bench or a vestibule. So with the homeless, some of the advocating I've tried to do is we got to hit the root cause. You know, right now the root cause is if they've committed a crime, you arrest them, they're off the street, but they're going to come back out again. Go to the substance use, because I know you probably don't want to hear me all night, but substance use, we were looking under Mayor Brennan to do what they call a acronym. I think it's a program that's out in Washington State, in Seattle. And really it allows the officer to make a judgment on whether or not, if he catches a person with any substance use, whether or not he takes him to jail, or he says, you know what, I could take you to jail, but we're going to get you some help, and you're going to do X, Y, Z. And if you don't do that, then later I can come back and charge you. But we received a little bit of pushback at that time from the prosecutor's office on whether or not that was, because it's kind of a control thing. You're given a lot of control to law enforcement and a lot of decision-making for law enforcement officer. But that's shown promise because of the fact that you have the carrot and stick, but you know, you've got them where they can make a decision here or there, take whatever box you want, and maybe we can make things better. It really is the root causes that, you know, we need to be focusing on, especially with the homeless. I mean, that is a revolving door at the Cumberland County Jail. You know, every Monday I can see them being released, time served, or whatever they've done. Now they've done some things. I mean, you know, during this pandemic, you know, I sat in on a command staff meeting with the Portland police chief and his people about what's going on in Bayside. And, you know, this was when we were advocating summons versus arrest. Well, I mean, they were, don't do it. Okay, don't do it. Dump the beer out. If we come back, we're going to summons you. You come back, they get the beer, so they write them a summons. I don't want to come back. They still have a beer. You know, at some point you arrest. But, you know, the thing is, for these folks, The summons isn't a deterrent. The jail isn't a deterrent. That's their lifestyle. And until we look at what is it that's going to deter these folks from doing their actions, maybe you can't do that. We're going to have the cyclical, revolving door. So.
You can't figure out what you need to do until you know what's happening now. You've got a good grip on that. I'm also I continue to be pleased, impressed, with the certification that the jail, that your operation has, which is, I think, is kind of leading the way in Maine, and I think other counties kind of went down the same path. I know it takes time and money to do it, and a lot of training and a lot of filling out reports and a lot of stuff, but, we have to run a top-notch operation. I think that's something very pleased with that, very pleased with the reports. Thank you very much.
So if you have any questions, you can call me offline as well.
Thank you, Shane. That would be great. Yeah, thank you very much. All right. Next, I need to turn my audio back on. Okay, let's see if I get too much feedback. Okay. Now we have comments from the public. Mr. Kennedy, do we have any comments that have been submitted?
We do not.
Okay.
There we go. All right, next is the consent agenda, and what we have is several items, 20-55, approval of a 3-year regional assessing contract for town of North Yarmouth, 20-056, acceptance of a $21,785 dividend from the Maine Municipal Workers' Compensation Fund. Next is 20-057, approval of contract between Maine Health, DVA Maine Medical Center and Cumberland County for the operation of an alternative care facility at the Cross Insurance Arena. And finally, 20-058, approval of contract between Global Spectrum LP and Cumberland County for the operation of an alternative care facility at the Cross Insurance Arena.
Mr. Chairman, I move the consent agenda items.
Second. Moved and seconded. Any discussion, or do we want to pull any out? Seeing none, all in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed may say nay. That passes unanimously. All right, new business. Appointment of the county's finance committee. This was item number 20-059. Gailey, I know we were having a difficulty handling the crowd outside today of the caucus.
As a result, exaggerated, yeah.
With overflow capacity.
Yeah. So could you present this item?
Thank you. This, as it has already been introduced this afternoon, starting at 4:30 and running until 5:30, we had the finance caucus for the 5 districts making up the commissioner seats. At this time, there was no attendees at the caucus, and I should make mention that the attendees who would participate in such a caucus would be elected officials coming from the 28 communities within Cumberland County. And we did not have any visitors this afternoon. We do have one remaining committee member that is serving her 3-year term as a finance committee member, and that is Holly Hancock from the town of Casco. And that was in the memo given to you last week. So this evening, I have nothing to add to that, as I made mention in my position paper for this item that we would be adding names if people showed up. but there are no names to be added this evening, so we are bringing forth just Holly Hancock to continue her term as a member of the Finance Committee. Thank you.
All in favor, say aye. Aye. Any opposed? That passes unanimously. Just for the event that somebody is watching this later on, we do look for, under our charter, elected municipal officials to be members of the Finance Committee that reviews our budget and gives us advice about how that should go. I was on this Finance Committee for a number of years. I think other people here have been. I have great sympathy for municipal officials. There's, proportionately, it's a very small pool of candidates, and the municipalities have a lot of meetings, and a lot of committees and so forth, and adding one more to it, I can understand why they're reluctant to come. It would be useful to have their input, but I'm not thinking bad thoughts about them for not coming to the caucus, but it is something that would be helpful if we had a little more discussion about our budget. But we will weigh in and proceed, and Ms. Hancock can give us the benefit of her advice on this. So thank you very much for that. Next is item number 20-060, which is amending the county's declaration of emergency. This was added to the agenda, I think, just this today or yesterday. So
This morning,
Mr.
yes.
County Commissioner or County Manager, please walk us through this one.
Thank you. Back on April 1st, in a special meeting that the commissioners held, the commissioners worked through a declaration of emergency as it pertained to the county. We are seeing a small number of municipalities at that time bring forth declarations of emergencies, and I felt as though the county should have a declaration of emergency to guide our process, to give some liberties so that we could shift, so staff could shift on the fly and meet the needs of our organization as we work through this pandemic, which the information that we were receiving and understanding was changing daily, if not weekly. So the commissioners at that time accepted the declaration as presented. However, there was an amendment at the end that there was a feeling that there needed to be some kind of duration or term of the declaration. And it was talked about at the commissioners level. You ultimately brought forth an amendment to have this, the April 1st declaration stand for 120 days. It just dawned on me last night, and don't ask me why it dawned on me, but we were over at a friend's house, and for some reason it just came to me that 120 days is the end of July, which is just a few days away, as July is quickly escaping us here. This would be a last opportunity for me to bring something before you to extend the declaration. I will say that we have a better understanding, and we're in a better position today than I feel as we were in April 1st. It was interesting going back through the declaration and seeing some of the data that we had put in that, and really reflecting on what we've really learned and where we've gone and where we've come back from over the last 2 or 3 months in writing this amended declaration. But I still feel as though there's a need to have some flexibility and some allowances in the coming months, as I don't think we're out of the woods yet. Cumberland County is still the hotspot of Maine for COVID cases. Though we're trending in a good direction, we still are trending. What we're hearing from all the professionals is that there could be another spike as we enter the fall season, winter season. And I just feel as though it would be prudent for us here 3/4 of the way through July to act on another declaration, extending it out towards the end of the year so that we can encompass the next 6 months and see where we're at. I think one of comments at the April 1st meeting was, that what I do through this pandemic should be reported out to the county commissioners, and if there are anything that needs to have formal action, that I could take a good step moving forward, but it should still come before the commissioners. And case in point, I have kept the commissioners abreast on every move we've made over the last 2 or 3 months. In addition, this evening, even though I have worked through 2 different contracts, one with Maine Health and one with Spectra, those 2 documents came before you after they were completed, so that, you're giving me the liberties to move forward with things, but they still need to come back, and the commissioners' eyes need to be on them and ultimately blessing them. So I'm hoping that you feel as though I'm living by your desires under this declaration, and I hope that you would entertain extending this to December 31st of this year, allowing us to make the moves that we need to make if we are finding ourselves in a tough predicament if this pandemic ramps up on us again. So thank you. And I'll answer any questions that you may have.
Yes, just a comment. I think it's wise. In the age group that I'm in, I'm looking for a vaccine to start to come forth before I'm going to be less intelligent. So, thank you for bringing it up.
Well, yes, I support that. I'm going to support this. I think there's a typo in almost the last paragraph. Talking about their respected community, that should be respected. Last. So take a look and see if you agree with me.
Are you implying, Tom, that
They're all respected. I mean, my
all of our
community,
communities in the county are respected?
but they're all respected.
Can that be a friendly amendment?
Other than that, I'm fully in favor of this. I think it's really prudent to have this out there. It gives us a little bit more flexibility. And I do think that the county government as a whole has been very proactive with this. I think we're seeing the benefits. We've mostly managed to maintain good health amongst our employees. Have not been the source of spread of virus as far as I know. And that to everybody's benefit, this will help us keep this in the front of our minds. So if there's nothing further, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? May say no. Hearing no opposition, that is passed unanimously. Okay, next is comments from the county manager. Mr. County Manager, you have the floor.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This evening, I really don't have
any
any
comments.
comments.
We will be taking August off, as we typically do. There's really nothing in the pipeline for the commissioners to take on. We tried to get that on this evening meeting. As the charter reads, the commissioners need to meet for 11 months out of the year, and historically, August has been the month that has been taken off. So what typically happens is I revert back and I work with staff through the month of August, and I regroup with the county commissioners in September to present the proposed manager's budget. So that's what we have on the radar, starting up as early as next week, really formulating the budget. And I'm meeting up with staff the first week and leading into the second week of August to get the department reviews done, ultimately trying to put a bow on my proposed budget towards the end of August for your review and recommendation or referral to the finance committee, that first meeting in September. So other than that, I'd like to thank the sheriff. I thought that was an excellent presentation of the information section this evening. Very well done piece of document that he provided, and very useful tool software also. So thank you for presenting that. Very enlightening. Other than that, thank you very much.
Ken, do you have any comments from the legislative side? I think these have been fairly quiet, but if you have anything to share with us, that would be great.
Yeah, I can tell you what I know. So the state did actually, project efficiently enough to finish the fiscal year 2020 budget balance. Actually, I think they might have had a bit of a surplus. The good news is, well, the bad news is the 2021 budget is where the problems will be, but they don't have to be dealt with in the immediate sense. They have some time that can, that budget runs until next through next spring. So the presiding officers have told the body about coming back to complete the work before them. The Democratic caucus voted to return. The Republican caucus abstained from voting except for one member. Their message was that they would only want to return to strip some elements of the governor's executive powers during the emergency and to deal with some emergency COVID-related issues. The Democratic caucus seems to be more interested in completing their work for the year. So I'm sure this won't be the last time that comes up. The Appropriations Committee has met several times over the course of the past 8 weeks, mostly just to listen to affected bodies so they know what to plan for when they do eventually come back in. I assume if the legislature does reconvene, they won't be spending any new money, and the Appropriations Committee will be very busy figuring out, what they need to do between now and the end of the calendar year. But as it stands, they're in a holding pattern. Committees are starting to meet. The Criminal Justice Committee has met a few times, but there's no dramatic action in any direction until they agree on if and when and what they might consider in a brief legislative session that we hold at the Augusta Civic Center.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Next is comments from the county commissioners. Commissioner Jameson, do you have some comments?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just very briefly, I'd like to encourage everyone out there to be smart, be safe, wear a mask. We've done a great job here overall in the state of Maine, putting box as much as we can around this virus, and let's not have a terrible regression and end up having a lot of our people hospitalized or sick. Let's keep up, these common sense and your safety. Schools are going to open in some capacity, probably a hybrid. Let's all be conscious of that, and let's work together so we can overcome this unusual problem as Mainers do with our ingenuity and our effort. And wish you all to have a great rest of the summer. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Commissioner Gordon, any things you would like to add?
Thank you very much, because you stole all my thunder. The only thing I would say is, it's going to be the gritty fortitude of what we want in the future that's going to carry us through. We can have citizens without a functional economy, as hard as that might be, but we can't have an economy without functional people. And so essentially, that's, I think, the battle that we're fighting. Please, be safe, wear your masks, wash your hands, protect others. That's what you're doing it for, is protecting others. Thank you.
Commissioner Cloutier.
I'll just say the thing that I notice every day, aside from the ever discouraging hard counts that get flashed across the screen about the progress of this virus, is they put up your various United States, and up in the upper right-hand corner, there's this place called Maine that's green, and sometimes Delaware is green, not always. And this has been true for the last month or so. It really is a tribute to the wisdom of people in the governor's office, CDC, FEMA here, and outside across the state, to be the only place in the country where that's true. And I have to say, the flip side is, I am staggered by the unwisdom of other places that are, with the benefit of wisdom, of experience, with the benefit of learned abilities to ameliorate various ways with infections occur, mortality and morbidity occur. What's going on right now in so much of the United States is it's a crime. That's what I got.
Yeah. For my part, I would repeat and amplify what folks have said already about taking care of your health, taking care of other people's health. We have been doing, I think, a remarkably good job in Maine of hanging together and, willingness to try to reopen the economy to the extent we can, but also not just rushing headlong into it. And I believe we will pull back if it turns out that there's a problems down the road. I will leave it at that. I think enough has been said, and I will have no further comments tonight. So thank you. Next is an executive session. Would entertain a motion to go into an executive session in accordance with 1 MRSA Section 4056D for the opportunity to discuss union negotiations.
So, second.
Motion second, discussion. All in favor, say aye. Aye. All opposed, say nay. So